When diplomacy stalls and war is too costly, nations find other ways to fight. Between 2009 and 2020, Israel and Iran waged a war without declarations, a shadow war. Scientists were targeted, centrifuges spun out of control, missiles exploded in the desert, and both countries denied so much. But this has done more than sabotage. It has been the evolution of modern statecraft, conflict by code, by proxy, by silence, by machine.
We're jumping straight into a conflict that you rarely see playing out on traditional battlefields, but one that has, profoundly shaped global politics for years.
Absolutely.
This is the complex, often hidden strategic struggle between Israel and Iran, and the intricate role the United States has played within it.
It's definitely a war you can't see, as some of the sources put it. Nations bleeding each other in silence, not with armies in the open,
Right.
but through espionage, targeted attacks, cyber operations, and, of course, the pressure of diplomacy and sanctions.
We've taken a stack of sources covering, everything. Targeted killings, sophisticated cyber attacks, intelligence coups, high-stakes diplomatic maneuvers, the works, to extract the absolute key insights from this invisible strategic landscape. What does this covert conflict tell us about modern statecraft, really?
And we'll draw directly from the details in the sources to explore, I think, two main areas. First, the direct covert actions Israel and its allies allegedly took against Iran, particularly hitting its nuclear program. And second, that strategic dance between the U.S. and Israel. It's fascinating how their alliance sometimes fractured and sometimes became remarkably unified when facing the Iran challenge.
All right, let's start with the most dramatic elements then. The invisible front lines, where physical attacks occurred, but without a declared war. The sources describe this pattern of mysterious incidents targeting Iran stretching back, to the mid-2000s?
That's right.
Think scientists killed, computer systems crippled, documents stolen. These are strategic moves, but all under layers of deniability.
And a really prominent feature of this shadow war was, a campaign targeting Iran's nuclear scientists.
Right.
Between about 2007 and 2020, reports indicate at least 5 scientists linked to sensitive parts of the program were killed.
Wow.
And these were widely attributed, certainly by Iran, to Israeli intelligence.
How are these attacks carried out? I mean, often in public, right? In cities.
The methods were quite specific and often brazen. Precision attacks right in cities like Tehran.
In Tehran itself.
Yes, we saw things like magnetic bombs, motorcyclists apparently attaching them to cars, for gunmen just opening fire in traffic.
Incredible.
It required, planning and audacity to operate like that, so deep inside Iran.
Can you give us a sense of who was targeted, and I guess why them specifically?
Well, the targets were generally key figures, people associated with different aspects of Iran's nuclear efforts. For instance, you had Masoud Ali Mohammadi, he was a physics professor, killed back in 2010, or Majid Shahriari, a nuclear engineer, killed the same year. He was reportedly a top expert on nuclear chain reaction.
Knowledge.
Definitely. Then there was Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan, killed in 2012. He was involved in procurement, specifically for the Natanz enrichment facility.
So hitting different parts of the program. Yeah. Research, engineering, supply lines.
And then a particularly notable case was Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. He was killed in November 2020.
I remember that one. Very high profile.
Extremely. He was seen as a very senior figure, long linked to Iran's past nuclear weapons work, the Ahmad project.
And his killing was different, wasn't it? It's more sophisticated.
Yeah, the sources mention reports that his killing involved a sophisticated remote-controlled machine gun, possibly even AI-assisted. It really highlights an evolution in the methods being used.
So what was the overall impact of this assassination campaign? Did it work?
Well, the sources point to a pretty significant psychological effect inside Iran's scientific community.
I can imagine.
Creating pervasive fear, a feeling of being under siege constantly. From the perspective of those carrying out the attacks, the goal was clearly delay.
Right.
Eliminate key talent, key expertise, slow things down. It arguably did succeed in setting back certain specific projects, but it also carried a really high risk of escalation. And it definitely sparked international debate about the legality, the ethics of targeting individuals this way.
A gray area.
Very much so. It's a stark example, really, of the blurred lines in this war in the shadows.
Okay, so from physical strikes, let's move to a different kind of attack. One conducted entirely in the digital realm, but as you said, with very real physical consequences.
Right.
This brings us to the Stuxnet cyber attack.
Ah, Stuxnet.
Oh.
Discovered in 2010, yeah. This was a highly sophisticated computer worm. It infiltrated Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility.
And what made it so significant?
The sources really highlight its watershed significance. It was specifically designed to cause physical damage to industrial equipment.
Right, not just steal data or disrupt systems.
It made it the first known instance of malicious code being used essentially as a strategic weapon to destroy real-world machinery, a digital weapon with physical impact.
And Natanz was supposed to be secure, right? Offline. How did a digital weapon even get in?
Good question. Natanz was what's called air-gapped, meaning it wasn't connected to the internet for security. So Stuxnet likely overcame that barrier by being introduced physically. Probably the consensus is via an infected USB drive carried into the facility by someone.
Wow, the human element.
It often comes down to that. Once inside, it exploited several previously unknown software vulnerabilities, what we call zero-day exploits, to spread and gain control of the systems.
And what did it actually do?
The code specifically targeted the industrial control systems, the PLCs, that manage the centrifuges used for enriching uranium. But instead of just shutting them down, which would be obvious, it subtly manipulated their speeds, made them spin too fast, then too slow, over and over.
Causing stress on the machines.
Precisely. This stress caused the centrifuges to literally, tear themselves apart over time. And crucially, Stuxnet simultaneously spoofed the monitoring systems.
So it looked like everything was normal.
It showed operators normal readings, making it incredibly hard to detect what was going wrong. It sowed doubt among the Iranian engineers about their own equipment, their own competence. Was it sabotage or just faulty machinery?
Devious. What was the practical impact on Iran's nuclear program then?
Sources estimate Stuxnet destroyed around 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz.
1,000.
Yeah, roughly a fifth of their operational capacity back then, around 2009, 2010. This disruption significantly set back Iran's uranium output. It bought valuable time.
Without dropping bombs.
Without a single bomb dropped, as one source puts it.
But it eventually got out, right? How was it discovered?
Yeah, it accidentally escaped the Natanz facility, possibly on another engineer's laptop or USB, and started replicating elsewhere. That's how cybersecurity firms found it and the world learned about it.
And the implications.
Its discovery was pivotal. It really signaled the dawn of a new era of cyber warfare. Proof that code could be a strategic weapon, almost like a bunker buster. It also raised incredibly complex questions. Attribution, it was widely linked to a joint US-Israeli program called Olympic Games, involving the NSA and Unit 8200, but never officially confirmed.
Right.
Legality, was it an act of war? And the huge risk of these powerful cyber weapons spreading unintentionally, getting out of control, it arguably kicked off a global cyber arms race.
So we have targeted killings, invisible digital sabotage. Now let's talk about an operation that sounds, straight out of a spy thriller.
Right.
A physical infiltration deep inside Iran to steal state secrets.
This is the 2018 Mossad raid on Iran's secret nuclear archive. It's quite something.
Tell us about it.
In late January 2018, Israeli agents reportedly infiltrated a nondescript warehouse in Tehran.
Just a regular warehouse.
Apparently. And they stole a massive trove, over 100,000 documents, files, CDs detailing Iran's past nuclear weapons program. The program known as Project AMAT.
Project AMAT.
Yeah.
Why was this archive important and why was it just sitting in a warehouse?
Well, after the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Iran, had apparently gathered all these sensitive documents detailing its earlier weaponization efforts, work done mostly before 2004.
Okay.
They consolidated it and hid it in this warehouse in Tehran in 2016. The thinking, presumably, was to preserve the know-how for potential future use while still maintaining public compliance with the nuclear deal's limits. Keep the knowledge safe, but hidden.
And Israel found it.
Israeli intelligence, reportedly using a mix of human sources inside Iran and electronic surveillance, discovered the archive and its location. Mossad then made the bold decision. Steal it. Not copy it, steal the whole thing.
That sounds incredibly risky.
Hugely risky. The planning was meticulous. Sources mentioned building a full-scale replica of the warehouse to practice the break-in.
A replica, wow.
Yeah. Studying guard routines, alarm systems, the specific safes the materials were in. They reportedly used around 20 non-Israeli agents on the ground for the actual operation.
Non-Israeli.
To make extraction easier, potentially. And they had a very narrow time window, something like 6.5 hours overnight to get in, disable alarms, crack the safes, remove tons of material, and get out undetected.
And they pulled it off.
Apparently so. The raid happened in late January 2018.
But the world found out later.
Yes. The dramatic reveal came on April 30th, 2018. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu held this televised presentation. Big screens, binders, CDs.
I remember seeing clips of that.
He stood there and declared, Iran lied, arguing the archive proved Iran had a comprehensive nuclear weapons program it had always denied.
What was the impact of that revelation?
For Iran, it was a major blow internationally. Hard evidence, Israel claimed, contradicting their narrative about a purely peaceful program. A big hit to their credibility.
And for Israel?
For Israel, it was presented as this triumphant intelligence success, a demonstration of their reach. But strategically, its biggest impact was arguably on U.S. policy.
How so?
The timing was critical. Netanyahu revealed the archive just days before President Trump's deadline to decide on the U.S. staying in the JCPOA. Reports suggest Netanyahu had briefed Trump on the archive's existence earlier, and the public reveal was coordinated with the White House. So just 8 days after Netanyahu's presentation, President Trump announced the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. And he explicitly cited the evidence from the stolen archive as part of the justification.
So the intelligence coup directly fed into a massive U.S. policy shift.
Directly. It gave the Trump administration, which already wanted out of the deal, a powerful public rationale based on Israeli intelligence. It shows espionage being used not just for information, but as a political weapon to shape international events.
Incredible. Now, beyond these really headline-grabbing events, the assassinations, Stuxnet, the archive raid, the sources indicate this shadow war involved a more consistent, lower-level pattern of sabotage too, right?
It wasn't just the blockbusters. The timeline includes numerous unexplained explosions at, say, missile bases, like Khorramabad in 2010, or a big one at Big Cana in 2011 that killed a key general, Hassan Moghadam, head of the missile program.
Right.
Explosions at military complexes like Parchin, which has long been suspected of nuclear-related work. And then there was that wave of mysterious explosions and fires in the summer of 2020.
I remember reports about that too.
Yeah, hitting various sites. An explosion damaged a building at Parchin again. A major fire destroyed a new advanced centrifuge assembly hall at Natanz. Other fires hit power plants, industrial sites.
Coordinated campaign.
Well, Iran often claimed accidents publicly, maybe to avoid showing vulnerability or being forced to retaliate. But the pattern of targets nuclear facilities, missile depots, critical infrastructure strongly suggested deliberate sabotage.
And the suspected perpetrator.
Often pointed towards Israel, sometimes with speculation about tacit U.S. support, especially during certain periods. The strategic aim seems clear. Slow down Iran's nuclear and missile programs incrementally, degrade capabilities, create setbacks, all without triggering full-scale conventional war.
And did the tempo change over time?
It seems to have fluctuated. Sources suggest higher activity, say between 2010 and 2012. Then maybe a lull during the intense JCPOA diplomacy and its early implementation. And then a marked resurgence from around 2018 to 2020, coinciding with the U.S. withdrawal from the deal and the maximum pressure campaign.
Interesting correlation. How did Iran respond to all this sabotage?
Often, as I said, absorbing the blows publicly, perhaps to avoid embarrassment or escalation, but behind the scenes, undoubtedly increasing security, counterintelligence efforts. They also rebuilt facilities, sometimes making them more resilient, like moving more enrichment underground at Natanz after Stuxnet and later incidents.
Right.
And sometimes they hardened their nuclear policy posture or made threats of retaliation, even if specific responses weren't always clear.
So, bringing this chapter to a close, looking at this whole range of assassinations, cyber attacks, espionage, sabotage, what really stands out to you about the sheer scope and audacity of these covert actions?
I think it's the persistence and the multifaceted nature of it. It shows a long-term strategic commitment to using covert means to achieve national security goals, specifically countering Iran's nuclear ambitions. It highlights the incredible capabilities required for intelligence penetration deep inside a hostile state.
Yeah.
And it underscores the willingness to operate in those murky legal and ethical gray zones, pushing the boundaries of conflict below the threshold of declared war. It's a constant, high-stakes game of cat and mouse, with Iran constantly trying to adapt and defend, ensuring this invisible front line remains very, very active.
So that's the war you can't see, fought directly, in the shadows. But as you mentioned earlier, this conflict is also deeply intertwined with a very public, yet still incredibly complex strategic dance involving the United States, its allies, and how Israel navigated that relationship.
Right. And the sources really highlight a significant period of, well, divergence, maybe even friction between the U.S. and Israel over Iran's strategy, specifically under the Obama administration, roughly 2009 to 2016.
Even though the covert conflict was ongoing.
Yes, and that's part of the complexity.
So how did President Obama approach the Iran challenge? What was his strategy?
Obama's strategy had two main pillars: strong international economic sanctions and diplomacy.
Right.
The goal was to use sanctions to pressure Iran economically, bring them to the negotiating table, and ultimately reach a deal to constrain their nuclear program. This effort eventually led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, in 2015.
What kind of sanctions are we talking about?
Pretty comprehensive ones. There were multiple rounds of UN Security Council sanctions. Then the U.S. enacted powerful unilateral measures, like Mossad, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions, Accountability and Divestment Act, which hit Iran's energy sector hard. There was the CBI sanction targeting Iran's central bank, making it very hard for them to handle oil revenues. And the EU joined in with things like a major oil embargo. The idea was really to squeeze Iran's economy, freeze assets, restrict trade, and starve the nuclear program of funds and resources.
Maximum pressure through economic means, essentially.
At that time, yes, designed to compel concessions at the negotiating table.
So how did Israel, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, react to this twin approach of sanctions and diplomacy, especially as the JCPOA deal started taking shape?
Initially, Israel strongly welcomed the tough sanctions. They'd been pushing for more pressure for years.
Okay.
But as the diplomatic track advanced and the outlines of the JCPOA emerged, they became, let's say, increasingly alarmed. Netanyahu became vehemently opposed.
Why the strong opposition?
His core argument, repeated often, was that the deal didn't go nearly far enough, that it provided Iran with sanctions relief upfront, legitimacy, and ultimately a pathway to a nuclear bomb once certain restrictions expired. He famously said, "No deal is better than a bad deal."
Right, I remember that phrase.
He also strongly criticized the deal for not addressing Iran's ballistic missile program or its regional aggression funding proxies destabilizing neighbors. The concern was sanctions relief would just give Iran more money to fuel that behavior.
And this opposition wasn't just private, was it?
Not at all. It led to extraordinary public rifts between the U.S. and Israeli leadership. The most dramatic example was Netanyahu addressing a joint session of the U.S. Congress in March 2015.
Without a White House invitation, right?
Correct, bypassing the usual protocols. He went specifically to lobby U.S. lawmakers directly against the deal the Obama administration was finalizing. He called it a historic mistake that paves the way to the bomb.
That's a major move for an ally.
Unprecedented, really. Clearly showed an ally publicly challenging the core strategic direction of its senior partner on a critical foreign policy issue. And key Israeli security figures, like the defense minister and Mossad chiefs at the time, echoed many of these critiques, though perhaps sometimes more privately.
So how did this divergence in the overt diplomatic sphere connect with the covert actions we were just discussing? Did they clash?
That's where it gets really interesting and complicated. As we discussed, some earlier covert actions like Stuxnet likely had at least tacit U.S. awareness or cooperation.
Right.
But according to reports cited in the sources, as the JCPOA negotiations intensified, the Obama administration actively pressured Israel to dial back certain covert operations, particularly the assassinations of scientists after 2012. The fear was that these actions could destabilize the region at a sensitive moment, or worse, completely derail the delicate nuclear negotiations. So you had a situation where the Allies' interests in the shadow war could actually clash directly. Washington prioritizing the diplomatic track and stability, potentially over-pursuing every possible covert disruption that Israel might have favored.
So different priorities, even with the same end goal.
Prevent a nuclear Iran, but disagreeing strongly on the means. And there's another layer mentioned in the sources, what they call political intrigue.
Intrigue. Go on.
There were reports, controversial ones, suggesting that Israeli intelligence actually spied on the P5+1 nuclear negotiations, the talks involving the US, UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, and Iran.
Spied on its own allies' diplomatic efforts.
That was the allegation. And that Israel then shared details gleaned from this surveillance with sympathetic US lawmakers to help them craft arguments against the emerging deal, to essentially fuel opposition from within Congress.
If true, that would be explosive.
It reportedly infuriated US officials at the time. The perception was that Israel was using potentially stolen secrets to actively undermine American foreign policy. It definitely strained trust within the alliance, even as broader security cooperation continued.
And this ties into lobbying efforts, too.
Yes, the sources mention Israel's significant lobbying presence in Washington through groups like AIPAC, which mounted a major campaign spending millions to try and block the JCPOA in Congress. So it was a multi-pronged effort: public critique, lobbying, and allegedly covert intelligence gathering used for political influence.
It's the Obama era then, characterized by public disagreement, private tensions, maybe even mistrust over the best path on Iran, despite sharing that ultimate goal of preventing a nuclear weapon.
That sums it up well. A silent struggle, perhaps, or a clear divergence between close allies playing out both publicly and privately.
How did this landscape change then when President Trump came into office?
This shift was dramatic, almost 180 degrees. It moved from divergence to what the sources call near total convergence under the Trump administration from 2017 to 2020.
Because Trump shared Netanyahu's view of the JCPOA.
Fundamentally, yes. President Trump entered office having campaigned strongly against the Iran deal, calling it the worst deal ever. He vowed to exit it, and he followed through in May 2018.
And then came maximum pressure.
He withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA and launched his maximum pressure campaign. The goal here was to inflict unprecedented economic pain on Iran, going significantly beyond even the tough Obama-era sanctions.
Oh, so what was new?
Key elements included reinstating all previous U.S. nuclear sanctions, but also adding powerful new ones. For example, ending all waivers for countries buying Iranian oil, aiming to drive Iran's oil exports to zero.
A major escalation.
Huge. And designating Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization. That was an unprecedented step, designating part of another nation's formal military structure as terrorist.
And the objective of all this pressure?
To cripple Iran's economy so severely that they would be forced back to the negotiating table, ready to agree to a completely new, much broader deal. One covering not just nuclear constraints, but also missiles, regional behavior, hostage-taking, or, alternatively, perhaps even regime collapse under the economic strain.
And Israel's reaction to this dramatic shift in U.S. policy?
From confrontation during the Obama years to, well, alignment and celebration, Netanyahu strongly praised Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, calling it a historic move and correcting a historic wrong.
So completely in sync now.
Completely. Israel's official messaging aligned fully with the maximum pressure strategy. Israeli officials consistently urged the U.S. to apply even more pressure to tighten the screws further. The public perception, and largely the reality, was that Israel and the Trump administration were operating as one on Iran policy.
Did this convergence extend to the covert realm as well?
Yes, significantly. The sources suggest that concurrently with maximum pressure, U.S.-Israeli clandestine efforts against Iran intensified. The Trump administration was reportedly far more willing to, let's say, greenlight or tacitly support Israel's secret operations inside Iran compared to the Obama administration's caution.
Linking back to that earlier point.
That wave of sabotage incidents we talked about between 2018 and 2020, including the big Natanz explosion in July 2020, is often viewed in this context. Conducted by Israel, perhaps, but with a greater degree of perceived freedom or even quiet backing from Washington.
What was the strategic thinking there?
The thinking, according to analysts cited, was likely that with Iran already weakened by maximum pressure sanctions and diplomatically isolated after the U.S. JCPOA exit, Israel could conduct these operations with potentially fewer repercussions. The message to Tehran was, we can hit you whenever and wherever we want, and the U.S. has our back.
Was there evidence of closer intelligence coordination too?
Yes, reports highlighted very close coordination. Strong ties and frequent meetings between key figures like CIA Director Mike Pompeo and Mossad Chief Yossi Cohen.
Right.
And the nuclear archive incident is, again, a prime example. Remember the timing. Netanyahu briefs Trump in March 2018. They coordinate the late April public reveal. And then Trump pulls out of the JCPOA just days later in early May, citing the archive.
Deliberate sequencing.
It appears very deliberate. After the raid, Israel immediately shared the archive contents with the U.S. intelligence community. Both Pompeo and Trump explicitly used the findings to bolster their case for withdrawing from the deal. It shows intelligence being shared and strategically deployed in near real time to achieve a shared policy objective.
Any other areas of alignment?
Sources also mention broader alignment, things like joint military contingency planning regarding Iran, Israel providing intelligence that informs specific U.S. sanctions designations or policy moves, and key U.S. officials under Trump like Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, Jared Kushner, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, consistently echoed viewpoints very closely aligned with Israeli concerns about Iran.
So, summing up the Trump era on this,
Under Trump, the divergence of the Obama years became near total convergence. Israel's hardline approach, which had clashed with Obama's diplomacy, effectively became U.S. policy. The two nations operated almost as one, you could say, with Israel often taking the lead covertly, and the U.S. providing the overt diplomatic and economic muscle. They were bleeding Iran in unison, to use that earlier phrase.
It's a stark contrast between the two administrations. Reflecting on that difference, what does this shift really tell us about the nature of the U.S.-Israel alliance itself and the factors that shape strategy?
I think it reveals several things. First, that even the absolute closest of allies can have profound, fundamental disagreements over strategy and tactics, especially when dealing with complex, high-stakes threats like Iran's nuclear program. The shared goal, preventing a nuclear Iran, was constant, but the means became a major point of contention.
And how?
Second, it shows how much leadership personalities and political alignment matter. The relationship between Netanyahu and Obama was famously strained, while his rapport with Trump was exceptionally close. That political chemistry, or lack thereof, clearly influenced the degree of strategic convergence. Third, it demonstrates how quickly and completely alignment can happen when political wills converge. The shift from Obama to Trump was rapid and total on the Iran file.
And the role of intelligence in all this.
It shows how intelligence can be either a point of friction, like the alleged spying on negotiations, or a powerful tool for reinforcing shared strategy and influencing policy, as seen with the nuclear archive. It depends entirely on the political context and trust between the leaderships.
And Israel's influence.
It highlights how a smaller, determined ally like Israel can wield really outsized influence on a superpower's foreign policy through persistent advocacy, strategic use of intelligence, cultivating political relationships, and frankly, having a very clear and consistent view of its own vital interests.
We've journeyed through the layers of this incredibly complex conflict. We've seen the war you can't see, this persistent covert struggle fought with targeted killings, cyber weapons, espionage, sabotage primarily between Israel and Iran, centered on the nuclear program.
And strategic insights emerge from looking closely at the shadow war. One is just how powerful intelligence and deception proved to be. These tools were arguably as decisive at times as open military force might have been.
Right.
The sheer audacity and technical sophistication shown in operations like Archive Raid or Stuxnet really highlight the evolving nature of modern conflict and statecraft. Mossad's ability to operate repeatedly inside Iran demonstrated a level of penetration.
And we touch on the ambiguity, right? These methods often operate in a legal and ethical gray zone. Targeting scientists using destructive cyber weapons like Stuxnet, it pushes boundaries.
It raises profound questions about the rules of engagement in this new era. Operating in a space where international law is still catching up, there's a definite moral ambiguity.
What about the psychological impact?
That's key too. The sources emphasize the effect on Iran creating fear, paranoia, a feeling of being constantly under siege, and potentially on the Israeli side, maybe a sense of confidence in their capabilities, but always balanced by the risk of exposure or retaliation.
And the bottom line, did it end the threat?
That's the point. These actions clearly delayed and disrupted Iran's program at various stages. They bought time, but they haven't ended it. Iran has proven resilient. They adapt, they harden facilities, they improve counterintelligence, they rebuild.
So the cat and mouse game continues.
It seems almost certain to continue. The underlying drivers of the conflict haven't gone away.
And finally, bringing it back to the U.S.-Israel alliance.
Yes, this period really illustrates the dynamics vividly. How even the closest allies can fiercely dispute the means to achieve a shared goal. How covert actions can sometimes work at cross purposes with overt diplomacy, or sometimes powerfully reinforce it, depending entirely on the strategic alignment between the leadership. And, as we said, how a smaller ally can wield that outsized influence.
So we've peeled back some of the layers on this complex, often hidden conflict. It really is a world of spies, sophisticated code, targeted strikes, high-stakes intelligence coups, and equally high-stakes diplomacy, all shaping the geopolitical landscape far from the public view we usually see.
It truly is. So maybe a final thought for you to consider. In a world where so much strategic conflict between nations seems to be migrating into the digital realm, into the shadows, using these kinds of covert tools, what skills or perhaps what kind of knowledge do you think becomes most for staying well-informed and understanding what's truly going on?
The bombs left no signatures. The worms left no trace. The alliances were unofficial. But the message was clear. No battlefield was too distant, no secret too deep, no program too sacred. And yet the shadow war resolved nothing. Iran's program endured, the conflict expanded, and the line between war and peace, between legal and lethal, grew harder to define. In the final episode of this series, we consider the present timestamp, a world shaped by surveillance, cyber threats, and alliances that may no longer hold.
Please like and subscribe.